So now humanity is incredibly busy trying to save the future for the posterity, and in some ways that's colonizing the future, right? So we set everything in motion, the transitions, technologies, mitigation, adaptation, everything, and the future generations have to live with it. If we don't do anything, they have to live with the climate change. So either way, we are colonizing the future. But then all this talk about global warming targets and carbon emissions, net zero, decarbonization, also needs to follow some core principles in terms of the integrity of these things that people are doing, like offsets or sequestration, etc. And we need some core principles. So here is the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, which has put out this report, which is long, so I'll just make a very brief summary of it. Core carbon principles, assessment framework, and assessment procedure. It's always good that some group always jumps on what is important and starts to take charge of making sure we don't go crazy doing things again. What is the Integrity Council? The Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, so that's ICVCM, is an independent governance body for the voluntary carbon market. Its purpose is to ensure that voluntary carbon markets accelerate progress toward the objective of combating climate change. It will set and enforce a global threshold standard for carbon credit quality, drawing on the best science and expertise available, with a view to also ensuring that high quality carbon credits efficiently mobilize finance towards urgent climate action. All good. It's a voluntary independent governance body, so how they will manage to implement and get participation will also depend on how the voluntary carbon market grows, and if peer pressure continues to grow as a way for corporations, industries, people, governments, and nations to do the right thing towards the global targets of net zero decarbonization and global warming targets, then we'll be off to a good pathway. Let's look at the definition of core carbon principles. These are just a bunch of texts that I'm going to read, and the whole report is very detailed in terms of all the assessment framework and procedures that you should read up if you're interested. I'm not going to go into those details here. So the definition of core carbon principles, this document defines CCP's core carbon principles for identifying high quality carbon credits. The CCPs form the basis of the Integrity Council's assessment framework, which elaborates criteria to evaluate whether carbon credits and carbon crediting programs reach a high quality threshold. The CCPs and the assessment framework define a threshold standard focused on the integrity of the voluntary carbon market. The CCPs and the assessment framework have been developed through an open dialogue with carbon crediting programs and other stakeholders, and draw from multiple sources, including the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's Paris Agreement, and Cancun Safeguards Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation of the International Civil Aviation Organization, and the work of Calyx Global and the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative. So when things are co-developed with all the key stakeholders, obviously they have a better chance of being a success. There's a nice bird call outside. I hope it's coming through. The CCPs represent a full set of interlinked principles and are to be considered in their entirety. They inform and guide the assessment of carbon crediting programs and different categories of carbon credits. The CCPs also enable the tagging of CCP-approved carbon credits with additional attributes that attest to other variable features associated with the mitigation activity. So everything shouldn't go independently. Adaptation, mitigation, sustainable development goals, voluntary carbon markets, because carbon markets may be driven by corporations and industries which have their own goals and need for success, profits, etc. So we have to kind of bring them all together under these core carbon principles. So they have few sections. Governance, effective governance is important. Tracking, so carbon crediting program shall operate or make use of a registry to uniquely identify, record and track mitigation activities and carbon credits issued to ensure credits can be identified securely and unambiguously. So tracking, monitoring, verification, reporting are going to be very critical to avoid greenwashing, where corporations might just claim things and not really do it, which is already happening, as we have seen in the integrity transparency report on move towards net zero, for example. Transparency is important. The carbon crediting program shall provide comprehensive and transparent information on all credited mitigation activities. The information shall be publicly available in electronic format and shall be accessible to non-specialized audiences to enable scrutiny of mitigation activities. The perception of mitigation varies across regions, by continents and countries, and everybody will learn more as this begins to become very routine, so that people know that there are no unintended consequences that are bad, for example. Co-benefits will be always good. Robust independent third-party validation and verification. The carbon crediting program shall have program-level requirements for robust independent third-party validation and verification of mitigation activities. This is tricky because you have to watch and wait, wait and watch, see how it goes, because things like organic food markets have had independent third-party validation. So when somebody sells, like Whole Food Market selling organic branded products, they rely on third-party certification, and there have been some issues of not meeting the organic standards and so on. So this has to play out in the future. B, emissions impact. Additionality is important, so that greenhouse gas emission reductions or removals from the mitigation activity shall be additional, i.e. they would not have occurred in the absence of the incentive created by carbon credit revenues. If you are doing something anyways and then you want to take credit for it by reporting it as mitigation or additional removal, then you cannot, you have to be held accountable or prevented from doing that. Permanence, the greenhouse gas emissions reductions or removals from mitigation activities shall be permanent, or whether there is a risk of reversal, there shall be measures in place to address those risks and compensate reversals. Robust quantification of emission reductions and removals is of course important. No double counting. The GHG emissions reductions and removals from the mitigation activity shall not be double counted, i.e. they shall only be counted once towards achieving mitigation targets or goals. Double counting covers double issuance, double claiming, and double use. This is very tricky because corporations, industries, or even governments tend to claim credits for things that are done in another context and then count it in two places, which is not good in the long run. Sustainable development. Sustainable development benefits and safeguards have to be ensured. The carbon crediting program shall have clear guidance, tools, and compliance procedures to ensure mitigation activities conform with or go beyond widely established industry best practices on social and environmental safeguards while delivering positive sustainable development impacts. Contribution to net zero transitions have to be monitored. The mitigation activity shall avoid locking in levels of GHG emissions technologies or carbon intensive practices that are incompatible with the objective of achieving net zero GHG emissions by mid-century. So if new oil wells are being built or new internal combustion engine infrastructures are being built, new coal plants are being built, that will be inconsistent and will lead to a lock-in into fossil fuel technologies that are not good for the net zero targets by mid-century. So reading few blurbs from each section, then the report has details on each of the sections we looked at here. The carbon crediting program shall have effective program governance to ensure transparency, accountability, continuous improvement, and the overall quality of carbon credits. The carbon crediting program shall operate or make use of a registry to uniquely identify, record, and track mitigation activities and carbon credits issued to ensure credits can be identified securely and unambiguously, as we saw before. The carbon crediting program shall provide comprehensive and transparent information on all credited mitigation activities. The information, which we already said before, shall be publicly available in electronic format and shall be accessible to non-specialized audiences to enable scrutiny or mitigation activities. People can protect themselves against unintended consequences or Frankenstein experiments. The carbon crediting program shall have program level requirements for robust independent third-party validation and verification of mitigation activities, which we already said. The GHG emission reductions or removals from the mitigation activity shall be additional, i.e. they would not have occurred in the absence of the incentive created by the carbon credit initiatives. So offsets, emissions, trading, etc. all have to be uniquely doing separate mitigation and not double counting. The GHG emission reductions or removals from mitigation activity shall be permanent, or where there is a risk of reversal, there shall be measures in place to address those risks and compensate reversals. If you are sequestering carbon somewhere and it begins to come back out, then you have to address those risks and compensate for the reversal of the sequestration, for example. The GHG emission reductions or removals from the mitigation activity shall be robustly quantified based on conservative approaches, completeness, and scientific methods. So everything will be bound by science, evaluation, and monitoring and reporting. The GHG emission reductions or removals from the mitigation activity shall not be double counted, as we said, i.e. they shall be only counted once towards achieving mitigation targets or goals. Double counting covers double issuance, double claiming, and double use. I'm reading some of these again so that the text without figures can still stick. Usually figures work better for these things. The carbon crediting program shall have clear guidance, tools, and compliance procedures to ensure mitigation activities conform with or go beyond widely established industry best practices on social and environmental safeguards while delivering positive sustainable development impacts. ESG, environmental, societal, and governance, have become a compliance issue now. So the data that needs to be collected is already having an impact. For example, the bank failure, the SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, that failed recently in the US, some political parties started saying that was caused by ESG reporting requirements. So you can see how politics plays when you want to avoid or inhibit or put a barrier on climate action, then it will be used as a tool in various contexts in a rather dangerous way, so we have to always watch out for those. Mitigation activities shall avoid locking in levels of emissions, technologies, or carbon intensive practices that are incompatible with the objective of achieving net zero GHG emissions by mid-century. So countries like India and China, which are still struggling to meet the energy demand to keep up their economic growth, have a tendency to invest in coal, which ends up being a lock-in and delays the phase out of coal, which is very essential to meet the net zero targets. So we have looked at various scenarios in the CDR combinations that will lead to minimizing impacts on water, energy, and land systems, for example, where CDRs work well in various contexts, but coal burning is going to be bad, with adverse effects coming on health as well. So it's not just CO2, but you have to also worry about objectives of net zero, but also other bad things that happen intentionally or unintentionally. The GHG emission reductions or removals from mitigation activity shall be additional. They would not have occurred in the absence of incentives. So the incentives cannot be misused to say something you have planned. Let's say a cement plant is planning to upgrade its energy source or its water use or its equipment to increase efficiency, but they will use that to get credits for mitigation. This will be essentially something that's not very good. The GHG emission reductions or removals from the mitigation activity shall be permanent, or where there is a risk of reversal, we will have compensating for reversals, as we said. The GHG emission reductions or removals from the mitigation will be robustly quantified based on conservative approaches. I'm repeating these things because I just kind of did a cut and paste from each section. From the summary, executive summary, I made these points, so they are being made again. So maybe you should wrap it up. The mitigation activity shall avoid locking in levels of emissions, which we just said. Okay, so sorry for the repetition, but you get the point that these core principles and framework for assessment and the procedures for assessment, ensuring the ESG principles, sustainable development goals, equality, labor market impacts, impacts on air and water quality, and so on, all have to be tracked. So we do need these core carbon principles because this is being driven at a very rapid speed, and again is being led by the global north. So we have to make sure that the global south doesn't stand by and watch as things happen that affect them negatively, or unintentional consequences they affect them. Okay, I have somebody at the door, so I'll stop it here.